This interview is brought to you in association with Rabobank.
Hello and welcome to another in our series of rural delivery interviews, where we speak with those who are influencing and reflecting on activities and attitudes across the primary sector. Joining us today is fourth generation dairy farmer, second generation veterinarian and agribusiness consultant, Dr. Alison Dewes. Alison, kia ora, thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
Alison, you've got a message for New Zealand farmers, dairy farmers in particular, that there's a different world that they can look forward to, one that has a lot less greenhouse gases, a lot less nitrogen produced, and a heck of a lot more profit. An industry that prides itself on being the farmer's market for the global villages, I think is your words. Tell us about that view, where it's come from for you.
Well, a lot of that came from my master's research, actually, where I studied worked with a group of Upper Waikato farmers over 4 years, and we looked at the range of their systems and what system was the most profitable at a long-term average milk price of sort of $4.50 to $5.50, and what environmental footprint they had. And at the end of the day, at the slightly lower average milk price of $5, the most resilient businesses, the ones that had the best return on capital and the lowest environmental footprint, were those that actually weren't overstocked. They were getting high milk production per cow from homegrown feeds. Their environmental footprint, which was a mix of things like nitrogen loss, phosphorus loss risk, and even potentially the risk of losing pathogens to the receiving environment, was actually a lot lower because they ran really simple systems. They ran things really well. They looked after the animals really well, and there was great stewardship and great focus. And those businesses consistently showed a higher return on capital with that similarly lower environmental footprint. So that was quite revealing for me, and it was really revealing for the group of farmers that I worked with. So and I think it's really transferable across New Zealand in a lot of cases. And I think, to be fair, the dairy industry is responding to this lower price signal, and we are seeing people adjusting their businesses back to what seems to be a structurally lower milk price.
What you seem to be describing here in those systems is, let's just call it farming with a cool head, stepping back from the heat that was generated in the market a few seasons ago, stepping back from that idea of constant growth and ever-growing volumes, and sort of pausing, looking around, picking up the best things that are available to you, but at the same time not trying to be too many things or do too much. Would that be right?
Absolutely. And to be fair, I think, I sort of say that our farmers have had their psyches milked a bit in terms of the encouragement for growth and more output and increasing use of supplementary feed and bigger is better. And yet when we analyse a true return on capital and profitability using the right measures across different parts of pastoral agriculture, big is not always better and more is not always better. In fact, because we've got three biological systems, which is people, the animals and the land, there's actually a sweet spot that operates best, and it's not all about more or more intensity. And so this is relevant across not just the dairy sector, but the sheep and beef as well, I'd say.
So if you were able to discover this in your master's thesis, why is it that it's not more widely known? How are you disseminating this information, or is this not something which farmers, can grasp for themselves if they look about?
Yes, look, I think it is, and I've said this a lot. The intuitive farmers are already doing this, and intuitive farmers are already looking well ahead of policy change. They're looking at what the consumers are wanting, and I generally think that smart farmers are already thinking about how they make their systems better, how are they going to add value, how are they going to potentially diversify in some cases now, and with things like, potentially talk around responding to climate change, even looking at retiring bits of land that previously might have been thought suitable for dairying, but retiring it and using it for planting trees or alternatives. And so I think there's a change going on anyway. I think people have said, well, hang on, the leadership that we've had or the messaging we've had in the past might not have been right. We've had a few shocks, And so it's a good time for New Zealand to stand back, widen back, as you say, and have a look at how we've been doing things and what's been driving us, and start rethinking and maybe even retrofitting some of our farm systems.
We have had last, say, 5-6 years, certainly, a strong focus, almost like a think big focus in farming. We've been driven, profits are driven by volume. We need more water, huge things like, Ruataniwha Dam, which I see has recently come out to be nearly $1 billion in overall cost, really big infrastructure, big ideas about how we get on. You seem to be advocating a return to looking within your farm limits, looking at the resources you have, looking at the inputs you have and what comes out of your farm, and getting a better idea about how to balance both.
Well, that's right. There are two things operating here, and you mentioned profits are driven by growth. Well, that's at a regional level. Our metrics that we use at a regional level for regional plans and how well a region's performing is the measure of GDP. Now, GDP really just looks at turnover and jobs created. It doesn't necessarily relate to profit back on the farm, and it doesn't necessarily relate to a whole lot of other things that we're having to address in New Zealand as well now, like the legacy of pollution costs through rapid development, where we're starting to get water degradation and cleanups required. It doesn't actually measure true long-term economic vitality, public health and well-being. A classic example is GDP. Well, Christchurch earthquake was great for GDP, but not necessarily for the people. So I think now we are running into some questions around what are the effects and legacies of these big developments. So you mentioned the Ruataniwha Dam, and there is potentially going to be diversity away from not just using it for dairying, because a lot of these irrigation schemes are predominantly, 60% of the water will be dairy or dairy support, in some cases more than that. But we've got to actually start looking at profit from the resource we use, or profit generated per million litres of water used. Now, some of these drivers or metrics haven't been used in the past, and I think we've got to get a lot smarter in New Zealand about how we measure profit and how we measure the cost of pollution.
Have you got a model you'd like to see us use?
I think GDP is not an appropriate model to measure these things. So what we've got to start doing is understanding the legacies and the effects of things that happen after, say, 10 or 15 or 20 years. And if I just use, say, Ashburton or the Highlands region as an example, it was great when there was a lot of intensity and growth and growth in dairy there. But 20 years on, now there's challenges around the limits, and the water quality and the source water quality is diminishing. Farmers are having to drop, their nitrogen loss by up to 50%. And these things actually challenge business certainty. So 20 years ago, the guys that converted the farms down there wouldn't have necessarily known that they were going to have to drop their nitrogen 20 years on. And these things, as you know, can be quite significant costs and system shifts for businesses to adapt to those sort of new rules.
If we're going to start shifting land use, or we're going to insist on chasing changes in land use, what sort of land use would you like to see beyond dairy? I mean, personally, I'd be going for kiwi fruit, but that's not obvious, and obviously not an option for everyone everywhere. What sort of diversification would you like to see?
Well, that's right. So I think it comes back to getting the fundamentals right about what we're measuring and thinking about the long-term effects of what we're doing. So we've got to preserve ecosystem health. I mean, that just goes without saying. And actually all farmers know that. They're stewards, they're intergenerational people. They think about their farm for the next generation, and they know that their farm relies on a healthy ecosystem. So that goes without saying, but we've got to be measuring that when we make these plans. Our rural economic wellbeing's got to be looked after. We can't be over-indebted for long term. We've got to think about this impending challenge of climate change, and rural communities being looked after as well. So how do we do that? Well, that's a really good question. Maybe New Zealand needs a vision, a really clear vision of what it is. Is it going to be a FedEx for milk powder, or is it going to be almost like a delicatessen or farmers market for the global village, and really play on the provenance story? We know that our consumers want green, safe and ethical food. We're seeing that with the welfare challenges that are coming through now. Animals have a new status in our psyche, and we've got to, and we know that we've got tourists now coming right through our farms, up and down our highways. They'll have GoPros on their helmets. They're looking at what happens in paddocks. Farming's got to go through a fundamental shift. Now, we shouldn't be scared of it, but it will require a brand new way of thinking and how we appear and how we can add value and what we do to add value.
I'm glad you mentioned tourism, because with numbers growing as rapidly as they are, tourists are going well beyond our major cities or the key tourist areas. A lot of them are here because they have an understanding of New Zealand as a clean, green country, high quality food, good quality people, open spaces, open hearts, open minds type thinking. What is that link between tourism and farming, and what more could be made of it, do you think?
Look, I think there's some fantastic examples emerging around the country, and I'm not sure if you are aware of Blue Duck Station. Obviously, that's a great working example of a sheep and beef farm. It also borders the Whanganui River, named as New Zealand's primary and best tourist destination 3 years running, over and above
Amazing.
Queenstown.
Yeah.
So what a fantastic story, and Dan Steele's just doing a great job there, but also wanting to encourage other farmers to think along those lines. So what we start to have a completely different lens on the land, the biophysical properties we've got on our land, and we look at it for its amenity value rather than what we can extract in terms of its resources. And so if we start looking like that, and also we retire the vulnerable areas on farms, and that's not going to work for everyone, but start looking at that as an ecosystem service or source or tourism support, we start looking at farming quite differently. And this is going to need leadership. It's going to need, careful transition. It's going to mean that some of the things that we got away with on our farms will have to change. It's a completely different value set. And so then we start getting into, well, okay, we've got to have values-driven science here. We've got to have values-driven systems. And so this is a completely different way of thinking from the industrial type, extractive growth type thinking that we've had here for 70 years.
Alison, we've run out of time. I'd love to pick up that comment around science. Maybe we'll do it another time. I'm quite passionate about science myself. Thank you very much for your time today. I think we're going to need to talk to you again in the future.
Cool. Thank you.
This interview was brought to you in association with Rabobank.